Let me hand it off to our wonderful presenters. I'm going to hand it off to Chief Nancy Timmons. She is the Chief Fire and Life Safety Officer with the Department of Healthcare Access and Information, HCAI, the artist formerly known as OSHPD, in the Facilities Development Division. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having us here. This is great to present and be better when we all get in person too. But as Lydia mentioned, yep, Chief Fire and Life Safety Officer at HCAI, and it's hard to say HCAI. I'm used to saying OSHPD. So I'll probably say that a few times tonight, but it's HCAI. Switching over. But thank you for having us here. I've been with OSHPD for almost 15 years and in this position for about 6 years. And prior to that, I was a fire marshal for the state of Michigan. Not the fire marshal, but a fire marshal for the state of Michigan that we basically did similar to what we do here at OSHPD. And then prior to that, a firefighter in Michigan. To Stephen.
Very cool. Hi, I'm Stephen Danaway. We're Kaufman engineers. I lead our downtown LA office and our Los Angeles fire protection engineering practice. So I'm a licensed fire protection engineer in California. I've been working in this area for about 11 years, and I've had the privilege to work on a variety of healthcare facilities, very big developments, and it's been, this is where the fire protection engineer is kind of like their playground. You get very complicated facilities. So, and we'll get into some of that in this presentation. So here's our learning objectives that I think that was covered in the advertisement. And so the agenda, we'll give a brief overview of the fire life safety concept. Nancy's going to take us through some Hkai updates, and then we'll go over CBC updates related to healthcare facilities. And then if we have time, we'll cover some key fire life safety issues we commonly see coming up. So I'd like to show this graphic. These are from an NFPA report that has information on various fire events in different healthcare facilities. So I want to highlight that column at the top graphic where in civilian deaths in these facilities, and that 4-year averages is a very good total. I mean, so I highlight that because it shows that as an industry, we're doing something right. It doesn't mean that we should do less. It means the provisions we currently have in our facilities, they're doing a good job. And this is not California, this is across the country. And you can see there's still a fair amount of fires that do happen. So this is why we do the various fire life safety requirements that we're going to cover. So just good to think about from a fire protection life safety perspective, why are hospitals different? And the main reason is we have many occupants who, what we call is incapable of self-preservation. They might be on life support, they may be undergoing procedures, they effectively cannot evacuate themselves in an emergency condition. And so therefore it's a unique safety hazard that the fire protection life safety requirements need to address. If there's a fire event, we can't just have everyone go to the stairs. So we need to incorporate features into our buildings that can protect those vulnerable occupants. So I want to cover the defend in place concept, which is how we do that. So say there's a fire in one smoke compartment, is what we call it, one area of the patient floor. So staff will be responsible for assisting with the relocation of occupants across smoke barriers into an adjacent compartment. Meanwhile, patients on that other side of the smoke compartment, they'll stay there in a defend in place mode, and that's where that terminology comes from. So they won't be evacuating, they'll be finding refuge, waiting as events unfold, and as staff and emergency responders decide what's the next course of action. Other occupants in the building, they can still use the stairs, and the stairs are a last resort if evacuation necessitates it, as well as a very important feature for the fire service to access the floors. So that's definitely why we still need stairs in our code. We have to incorporate them into our designs. Okay, so that I'll turn over to Nancy, and she'll take us through the Hkai updates.
It's just a brief, thank you, Steve. Just a brief update. Some of this is old news now, but still big changes. All upper management is new. So Paul Coleman retired, and Gordon retired from some of you might be familiar with him from working in the LA office. He was the deputy division chief in LA. And Our director's new. I didn't put her name on here, but Elizabeth Blansberg, she's new as well. So literally everyone above supervisors and up are new to their positions, not necessarily new to FDD. So Chris Tokus is the new, I say the new Paul, but people know Paul's name, but Chris is the new deputy director. And Arash is the new deputy division chief in LA. Richard Tannehill is the new deputy division chief in Sacramento. And project-wise, the numbers are, like, again, this is a little bit off, but about 19 billion in construction projects right now. We actually had about 80% of our staff teleworking, but we've since brought them back. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays, we are back in office. And then they work from home. Most people work from home Monday and Friday. We have about 33 vacancies at an FDD. So if you're looking, keep us in mind. I'm sure everyone's in the same boat there. It's hard to find people right now. And then the last piece, we'll talk about this a little bit later, about the COVID response and the updated all facilities letter. I think it's on the 6th update maybe that came out in March, and it's to the new dates now to stop using the spaces that were allowed to be used for COVID. You know, for example, using offices for patient areas that was allowed under this letter with minimal oversight. That will expire in June. So those areas have to discontinue that use in June and then be put back to its original condition by August 11th. So that's most of it, but we'll talk about a little bit more about that later. Thank you. So some of the direction in healthcare has been leaning more towards psych facilities, and you've probably seen some of that with some of the code changes in the past couple editions, just news alone, right? And then after COVID, just mental health needs just skyrocketed. So a lot of our HCAI's focus, so well, and there's HCAI and there's FDD. So HCAI is like the big umbrella, and then FDD, who you're probably used to calling OSHPD, the building department part. We're actually facilities development division. We're one portion of HCAI, but HCAI as a whole, the focus is really big on mental health right now. And as I mentioned, through our code, through the years, we have changed code a bit to also move towards this, and you'll probably see some more changes in the near future to keep this momentum. So in 2016, in our mid-cycle edition, that's where a lot of our changes happened. Some of you are familiar with the I2, I3 use. Steve and I were just talking about that a few minutes ago, and some of the confusion that was there that was mostly fixed in our 2016 code cycle. And then in the 1228 portion, there were some requirements or some allowances, with however you want to look at that were specific for site that were added to 1228. And then we also have OSHPD 5. Oops, I don't think that's in this slide. It might be the next one. But anyhow, again, there's a lot of changes with how psychiatric facilities are being looked at least California-wise, and structurally, the bigger changes have been structurally. And that's, as you can see in the second bullet point, that the structural requirements are now based on model code, with the importance factor being used based on the number of patients instead of the number of stories in a building. So that's a big change structurally that has happened. And then the architectural portion, there are some specifics that you might need in a psychiatric unit that you may not in a typical I2 setting, and vice versa. So addressing some of those changes. And then, of course, with identifying these as blocked I2s as opposed to I3s was helpful in alleviating some of the confusion that was there in the past. There is a advisory guide out that you could find on our site. This is just, it doesn't replace code. It's just a guide, as it's titled, to help facilities and designers look at what they might need to get through a project with psych facility in it. And some sample AMCs, which are always helpful. Well, that's a good guide. We have some other guides on our site too, if you take a look at those, but that's one big one. Something that we've worked on this past year is a template design. An entity came to us with, I don't remember how many, I think they either 9 or 11, there might be more. They want these facilities throughout the state and wanted to submit it as a template. So you get all the major items through, kind of a exaggerated preliminary review with OSHPD, but it was a very, very detailed review, of course. See, I said it already, HCAI, OSHPD, we'll just use them both. But anyhow, set this template in, and it comes in various, there's a 1-story model, a 4-story model, a little bit of a different layout, but basically these 3 design concepts had us look at, basically review that, and then with the intent, of course, to have the next review process go through much faster for the number of facilities they want throughout the state. Interesting designs, and a lot of, although we do match NFPA 101 requirements when we can, and that's our goal often when we're changing code, there are still some differences. So when you have entities from different parts of the country, there are some California specifics that they may not be used to, but I ironed some of these out, but just part of the help in trying to move these site facilities to the forefront and help these get them in faster and get them through the process faster, because they're really desperately needed. The one slide, if you see that when you're printing it out, it had some numbers of psych facilities throughout the state for adult beds versus child beds in 2015, and what that was. That wasn't that long ago, and the numbers aren't very high, and then to what we need right now. And another thing that we've been working on are microgrids. That's something many people are probably hearing a lot more often now. A lot of work has happened on the OSHPD side. I'm just going to stick with OSHPD, I think, today. HCAI, if any of you have had the opportunity to work with Jamie Schnick, I think he said his last name. He's an electrical engineer with us. He has done a lot of work for the microgrids and incorporating this into code. He's really worked hard. He's worked with people across the country, just done a great job. We have a white paper out that it's lengthy, a lot of information on it, but our microgrid systems at this point in time cannot replace generators. So these are these alternate power, but you cannot replace generators right now because that's not permitted per CMS. So we still need these generators, but we're still moving forward with the code for microgrids, because that seems to be where we're going in the future. And we do have projects right now that have used these, but they're a tertiary system. So again, they cannot replace the generators. Generators still have to be there. But as a tertiary system, great. We've got multiple projects in-house that have started this, and you might be seeing more of this. But if you can take a look at that white paper, a ton of information on there to help out. As I mentioned, different groups, focus groups that we've had with this, the collaboration with entities across the country, and we're continuing to move forward. Our code is set for this. We don't really need to make more. Well, there's always more changes, it seems, in the code, but the infrastructure is there in the code to be able to use these. But I'll keep stressing that again, it cannot replace the generators. These are just tertiary systems. And sorry, I'll back up. Not that you need to see this to hear me say this, but if you're not familiar with 1206 of the fire code, please take a look at that and look at the mid-cycle 2019 mid-cycle version. The 2019 version was printed prior to lessons learned from a pretty bad event in Arizona, where one of these storage systems, there was a fire at this, and a firefighter was blown 75 feet when they opened up the door to one of these. And it's just like, backdraft in a way, but in real life, but the pressure inside of this, it just grew, and the last piece that this needed was oxygen. So once that door was opened, it blew that firefighter about 75 feet, but it injured multiple firefighters. So typical fire code comes into place because of death or injury. So when SFM was writing changes for the mid-cycle, they really pushed to get the changes in 1206 and CFC to mitigate some of these concerns. So take a look at that. I do training on 1206. That's a complete, it's not a full day, but it's a few hours. But read through it. There are requirements for the different types. You know, is it an outside component? Is it inside the building? Is it mobile? So there are different requirements for each type of, I can't think of the word.
Yeah, energy storage
Thank
systems.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
lithium-ion batteries.
Yes, that's the big piece. And what are they in? So that's the piece I'm stuck on. It's not its own little building, its own little component, or inside the building. A lot of different requirements. Thank you. Another that you might have seen is that with the different technology are these prefab. Obviously, prefab's not new, but to try to use it in a healthcare facility is a bit newer. We have worked with different companies for getting pre-approvals, but please keep in mind that the pre-approvals are for structural only. Fire-wise, fire life safety-wise, we're going to have to look at each of these case-by-case basis. The one that this is, you'll see some pictures from, one company is using restrooms. They're using it just for restrooms at this point. So they've gone through the pre-approval process at HCAI and they've gotten through that part. But again, for fire life safety, where, you know, we have to look at something as simple as where is this pre-approved, geez, sorry about that, prefabricated restroom. Is it along the wall of the corridor, the fire partition? Is it along a fire barrier? How do the sprinklers come into play? Fire alarm? What finishes are being used? So again, fire life safety wise, that's not what the pre-approval is for. It's just structural. And then fire life safety will still look at everything. But regardless, it does help it move through a bit faster to get through the structural side. And not difficult, especially when it's a restroom, not difficult fire life safety wise, looking at what you would normally look at with code. So I started seeing these a little bit more. Shouldn't name names, but that's one. And then just a slide that shows some of what you may see if you're looking at the pre-approvals on our site. This one, I almost hesitate to bring it up, but no, this is a great thing. If you aren't familiar with this, it's kind of a new but not new CAN. It's CAN 1-7-153. It's a CAN for non-material alterations to approved documents. We had a CAN previously, and then it was rescinded because all the information was pretty much in the code and then also in our freer manual. But as some of you might be familiar with, this causes a lot of confusion. When a change is made, it's materially altered or it's not? Who determines that? What types of changes fall under which one? This CAN will help guide design professionals through that. But keep in mind as you're reading that, look at the freer as well, because this is very general. The freer will get into some of the specifics. But anyhow, this is a new CAN. We've got trainings on this. I'm sure we'll do more trainings. If you haven't attended, keep an eye out on our site. There's a recording that's for one of them, but I would assume that we'll be doing more of these because a lot of questions come up with this. It's not difficult, really, once you read through it. It's just putting again, helping determine if the change is materially altered or non-material altered, and then also having the design professional, putting that ownership back on the design professional, which is where code says it should be, and laying out, all right, here's what was approved, here's what the approved construction document said, here's the change we want to make, here's the difference. here's why we think it's a material alter or non-material alter. And if it's material alter, it's going to need an ACB, but it just helps lay that out and to help it go smoother, because if you've got it laid out, here's what was approved, here's the change, and here's why we need it. It just makes that whole process a lot faster. This will help guide you through. This is just a slide about speaking of amended construction documents. Where do they come from? And a lot of times it just shows you here. We can run the report on where they come from. And you've got the chunk that comes from an owner request, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, where as they're seeing this facility or this area remodeled and seeing what else they might want in there, there's some changes that they might call for. And then contractor requested is pretty high as well, but design professional requested, that's not too high. And then discovered conditions, always a problem, right? If the owner, we don't want you in here now because we don't want to stop surgery today, it's going to cost a lot of money, but then you get up in there when it's time to do the work and find all these conditions that you weren't aware existed, and now adding 2 or 3 months to the end of construction. So it doesn't really save time. So we try to help the owners understand why it's really important to let the design professional up and poke their heads into that ceiling, see what's in there, see what they need to design for, and help mitigate some of these discovered conditions. This is a little bit more about the letter, the all facilities letter with the COVID response. Again, that's the latest, and we're not expecting this to change, but we've said that before. But the latest revision was in March. Again, the use, those spaces that were allowed to be switched over for patient care will have to be, that use of those spaces discontinued in June and put back to its original condition in August. So just made the colors here stand out a little bit, so those dates stand out. So again, this was for the temporary use. I use the example of a business area being switched over for patient care, and they want to put that back to that business area. Good, go put it back to original. If a project is, sorry, this is about the pre-existing. If they want to make it permanent, like, well, all right, we switch this area over and it works out great, we want to keep it this way, then you've got to submit a project, and that project will have to comply with current code when it's submitted. And we start doing them now. If you know that you want to keep, or if the facility knows that they want to keep the area the way that they switched it over for COVID, but they want to keep it permanently, then get the projects in. Back up a slide here. For the work that is going to be restored back to its original condition, if a plan review isn't needed, as long as, when I'm teaching code, I always say provided and or, those are big words in the code, but you won't need a plan to put it back to its original condition, as long as that you've got to contact the compliance officer, advise them of the restoration that's happening, and then a field report will be issued. And also check with CDPH to determine their steps, because we can't speak for them. But typically, to put it back to exactly how it was before COVID, shouldn't need a plan, but you will need to have communication with the compliance officer.
Okay, great. Well, that was a lot of great information.
Thank you, Stephen.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
So now we're going to jump into the 2022 CBC updates. So we're going to focus more on updates for I2 occupancies. And, there's a lot of changes. So this is not a full presentation of every single change. So just keep that in mind. And as a reminder, I believe the first printing is coming out July 1st of the code of this edition. And January 1st of next year, 2023, is when we're going to see this take effect.
Do you want me to talk a little bit about
Yes,
that?
and so Nancy is really involved in the process of change, and she's going to talk a little bit about that.
So you might be familiar with how the process works, or maybe not, with our architectural, structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing changes, that happens through our building standards unit. They make those changes and it goes through the whole process with the Building Standards Commission. For fire life safety, we work under the umbrella of SFM. So in our fire prevention unit, we do those changes for fire life safety changes, and it can be through any, it's not just building code, but of course, building, fire, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, whatever is related to fire life safety, that would be ours to change. We do those, we make those changes, and then I submit our changes through to SFM. And what Building Standards Commission, they'll present it to Building Standards Commission under their umbrella with DSA, HCAI, and all of their own. So you may see some presentations from BSU and wonder, why is fire life safety never talked about? It's because we do this under the umbrella of SFM. And of course, our building standards unit is involved with that. But when I submit our changes to SFM, I also, we're working all the time with building standards units, so that if I'm making changes that affect them and vice versa, we're on the same page. But the actual process is this: for fire life safety goes through SFM, then Building Standards Commission, as opposed to BSU to Building Standards Commission.
Yeah, so it's fairly complicated.
Yeah, and a lot of time.
Yeah, so it's
right when you finish, you start again you finish the 2022 and you're already writing for mid-cycle. Like we're on mid-cycle 2022 right now, getting ready to look at changes for 25. So it's constantly changing.
Yeah. Okay, so to jump in, so this change has to do with sleeping suites, and really what this change is trying to emphasize the requirement that in sleeping suites, you either need to have direct supervision of the sleeping rooms, or you can have a fully sprinklered building and an automatic smoke detection in the sleeping care suite. I think this was because existing buildings that weren't fully sprinklered were trying to take advantage of some of the requirements.
Right. So if you have a existing building that's remodeling and they say, hey, we can just pick option number 1, we can just have, oops, I'm sorry, they have to pick that one. I said that backwards. Let me back up a little bit. So with the charging section, that is the modifications to existing facilities should continue to provide direct, that's not the charging section. Sorry, that was changed. Sorry about that. The charging section right underneath, care suites containing sleeping rooms. Sleeping rooms shall be permitted to be grouped into care suites where one of the following criteria is met. In model code, this has changed through the years. If you recall, there used to be a limit for eight people in the suite. And then a visual from staff into the room. Not the same visual that you have for the Chapter 12 requirements where it's eyeballs on the patient, but eyeballs into the room. Model code changed it a couple editions ago, and we did not. We kept it with the numbers, with the 8, for a couple of reasons. One reason we decided to change it this time was in Chapter 12, you've got a limitation of 12 people. So the 8 and 12, there was a disconnect there. So we were going with model code, but with model code, they're writing this with, we're just building new. And in a new I2, you're going to be fully sprinklered. So what we didn't want to have happen was in our buildings that remodeled that weren't fully sprinklered, to have them take this option of not having the direct supervision of these rooms and say, hey, we don't have to anymore. This section says all we have to do is put smoke detection in there. So we wanted to make it clear that that you need to be, if you're going to just have if you're going to add the smoke detection, it also has to be a fully sprinklered building. It's that give and take with the code. If we're taking away that direct supervision and putting in detection where it otherwise wouldn't have been needed, you don't want to give two gimmies, right? So fully sprinklered building and smoke detection is what they would have to use number 2. If they're not fully sprinklered, then they can only use number 1.
Yep. Okay, so this is you might recognize this is a passenger drop-off area. So the last few code cycles, HCAI has enforced this CAN 2-508 and the port cochere CAN. So pretty much all new hospital facilities will have a passenger drop-off area and a ambulance loading area. And Chapter 11B requires those areas to be covered with canopies. And so there are some fire life safety implications for that. And the new code is implementing some of the requirements from the CAN. So this is in chapter 5, they're adding an exception to the code that recognizes that these porte cocheres can be treated as accessory occupancies. The CAN does allow 4 options, but the accessory occupancy option is probably the most common one that's used. And then this footnote I that got added is if you have a drop-off canopy or a loading canopy that is accommodating vehicles other than passenger or ambulance vehicles, like a loading dock area or just a loading vehicle, the accessory occupancy option is not going to be allowed by HCAI. And then that effectively results in a fire separation to the building. And so that's where these code changes are coming into the code now.
Do you mind if I add a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
So like Stephen mentioned with the accessory section in 508, these drop-offs for ambulance and patient drop-off areas that are required elsewhere in the code in 11B and 1224, when it's required by those sections, then they can be considered accessory. However, they still have to meet the accessory requirements, being it has to be ancillary to the main facility, so it's got to be accessory to the eye, and less than 10% of the S2s or the other accessories on that floor. And if they exceed that and can no longer be considered accessory because they exceed the limitations for accessory, they then have to be separated. So the footnote is going to indicate that when you cannot be accessory and now you've exceeded the 10% or whatever, or it's not ancillary to, they put it on another side of the building for whatever reason, whatever that might be, it no longer falls under the allowances of being accessory and now has to be separated. And when you look at the table, it's going to say, well, between an S2 and an I2, you need 2 hours. So the footnote is saying you can reduce this to 1 hour if it's one of these 2 required drop-offs. And then, like Stephen mentioned, when it's loading dock or delivery trucks, that's separate. No pun intended. Those will have to be separated with the 2 hour. There's a provision in, I think it's 406, that differentiates between the types of vehicles, and you have to dig a little bit to get past what they're referring to in 406. But essentially, it comes down to the weight of the vehicle. Typical ambulances and of course passenger vehicles don't cross over that threshold, so we can consider them in this area here, but once they cross over and it's like a delivery truck, then that's, and I don't have the exact weight limits or anything like that, but it comes from 406. It's no longer one of these reasons, right? It's not an ambulance drop off, it's not a patient drop off, it's loading dock, it's delivery. That's separate, and it would need to be separated with the 2 hour.
If there's an eye occupancy.
If there's an eye occupancy, yeah.
And then this is the last requirement, so tying it to requiring an automatic sprinkler system for these porte cocheres. So if you have this on your project, keep in mind, do I need a separation from the building? Type of construction is a big issue that comes up, and do these buildings need it, or do these structures need fireproofing and then sprinkler protection? So tying back to some of the information Nancy was covering. So this code change has to do with areas where patients are restrained. So often in those behavioral health facilities, this was, I'd say, a clarification, but we wanted to point it out. So just to keep in mind that where you have patients who are restrained, you need smoke detection throughout the compartment they're in. And then if they use any means of egress through adjacent compartments, those also need full area smoke detection. So in new facilities, we often see full area smoke detection. So that's not an issue there, but for existing facilities, something to take note of.
This was missed. It was put in CFC, but publisher error, not in CBC. So we just resubmitted to put it back.
That happens fairly, not fairly often, but don't be surprised. Yeah.
It happens.
So this is an interesting change. So first I'll focus on the red crossout. So that's from the 2021 IBC, that they've struck the maximum door width limit. So it used to be 48-inch nominal limit of a single leaf. So that's struck. That doesn't mean you can just make the door any size, because the door force limits still apply of chapter 10 and 11B. And so we still have to adhere to that. But it does restrict, like if you have a unique situation, you don't have to do 48 inches max. The other change is for I2 occupancy specifically that, and this is how I think HCAI has enforced it over the years, but now it's in the code. So if you have a door opening greater than 4 feet opening, maybe you have a 6 foot width, and serving I2 occupancies, you need at least one of the door leaves to provide a 44-inch clear. So you couldn't do a 3 and a 3 foot door in that situation. You have to do it uneven pair. And that's how it's been enforced, but now it's clarified in the code. So that there's a, it won't be disputed.
Hopefully, right. And remember measuring there, you need the 4.0 with the, because the measuring the 44 is between hardware and the fist. So that's not part of this, well, it's part of this section, but there's another section that addresses it more specifically. But I presented this to our staff last week and they said, don't you still need the 4.0? I said, yes, because you still need the 44 between the hardware and the frame. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, hopefully this will put this one to rest.
Yeah, and so this code change has to do with votes on the inactive leaf of a pair of doors. And Nancy was explaining to me the change was really intended to address discrepancy when you have a corridor door. In I2 occupancies, the doors need to be positive latching, and there's some confusion over how this code section affected that. Do you have any insight on this section beyond that?
It's not too much past that. I mean, you've explained that. What does your door have to do in a corridor versus a suite? And if it has a leaf, how does that leaf operate? Like sometimes we'll find in corridors when both doors are open and you close the main door and the leaf isn't latched, then there is probably more confusing talking more about it than not, but the door has the positive latch, yes. And then what about this leaf? Does that have to, like, not necessarily, but it can't prevent the other one from latching. But there are other provisions in 101 talking about how does it latch. So this was put in here just to show that, yes, you can have a manually operated latch for when it's the edge or surface mounted. So when it's on either the face of the door or on the side of the door, that of the leaf, excuse me, not the door, that you can have that manual on that leaf as long as that leaf isn't needed for the 44 clear, which it shouldn't be anymore because we made the other change in the code. But that bolt also has to be self-latching. So when that leaf is closed, it self-latches. Oops, I'm sorry that we had both manually operated, and it probably made it a little confusing there. But anyhow, it's just to help you figure out when you do have that leaf, what do you do with it? So it's not just swinging.
Yeah.
What do you do with it?
So here's a change. The change on this slide is really footnote A was added. And it's a reminder when you're looking at the chapter 10 egress corridor widths that there are still corridor width requirements in chapter 12. The codes, you see 96 inches, that's always going to be required for I2 with bed movement. We're seeing as the development of the psychiatric and behavioral health, we are seeing if you can do 72 inches if you don't have bed movement. But then that footnote says just go back to chapter 12, 1224, and really 1226 for OSHPA 3 and 1228 for OSHPA 5 also will send you back to the 1224. So really we're having to meet the most restrictive. It's a good way to think about it. So dead end corridors, I think this one we wanted to just caution the audience. There's a code change that allows 30-foot dead ends in I2 occupancies, but that red text is in the IBC and in the CBC. So the corridor can't serve any patient rooms or patient treatment spaces. So we can't just go to 30-foot dead ends for any corridors, and maybe most corridors are still 20 feet. California also made a change to clarify that the 30-foot increase would only apply in fully sprinklered buildings. That 30 feet does align with the life safety code. So it is interesting that the IBC made this change. So just be aware of that. Sticking with 20 feet is a good starting point, and we'll go from there. So sprinklers and elevators, this has been something that's come up a lot over the last few code cycles, and effectively there's been a shift in the industry, probably dating 10 years now, to get rid of sprinklers in elevator hoistways, machine rooms, other elevator spaces. Various reasons. One is the impact of the fire service to use elevators. The other is just safety of construction workers and people who maintain the elevators having to get into the shafts, which there's been a handful of accidents or events. So the change here was that 903.3.111, it used to say in other than group I2, I2.1, I3, and then it had the list. And so because of that language, we always have needed an AMC to omit the sprinklers in the hoistways. So because I believe you had worked to help get that out of the code, so we don't need that anymore. And we still have to meet different requirements in NFPA 813 and the CBC to actually get the sprinklers out of there. And so that's what HCAI would be reviewing for, those code requirements, but it's no longer an AMC process. It's just part of the normal plan review process.
And remember, when you're looking at the elevators, that freight elevators, you still need the sprinklers. So a few things to keep in mind with the sprinklers and the hoistways and these different areas are, do you need shunt trip? You might not be able to remove it. How is recall happening? So there's a lot that goes with this, but generally being able to take the sprinklers out of the hoistways and machinery rooms is now something that HCAI does also adopt, but it always comes with it depends. What's the elevator that you're working with? Is it passenger or is it freight? And then what kind of freight? There's like 5 classes of freight elevators, ranging from something you just put pallets in versus drive a vehicle into. So obviously we don't see the vehicle one too often, but or ever. But anyhow, so keep in mind that, yeah, we do adopt this and we do make these changes so it matches model code, but you may still need smoke detection or sprinklers even, depending on the type of elevator that you have, and then what's happening with shunt trip and recall and requirements that CFC has, high rises, etc.
Yeah, elevators and fire alarms and fire protection can be complicated. So this is a change in the IBC that they introduced an exception that does not require fire barriers to extend up to the deck for an exit passageway. And you would really do a fire resistance rated horizontal assembly. This is not just a wall turned on its side. It'd have to be a horizontal assembly tested in that orientation. So this is the IBC change. One tricky part of the change is the way it's worded. It says you don't need to extend up to the roof, sheathing, deck, or slab. It doesn't say floor or roof, sheathing, deck, or slab, which I think that was a typographical issue. There was no mention in the ICC's reasons for changing it that it was only for a roof, and you often wouldn't have a passageway at the roof. So we'll see how that gets enforced by code officials, but this comes up a lot, especially in existing buildings where you're tacking on an addition and you have a stairway that used to discharge to the outside, and how do you get those people out? So I know it's something we've all dealt with, so we'll see how this develops.
It should be, and it was in old code. We might remember that it was in old code, then went away. Then we would do AMCs, like Steve said, for the existing facilities. So now it's coming back again. So that'll make a lot of lives easier.
Yeah. And so I know we're talking about the healthcare facilities, but we have a lot of parking garages at these big facilities. So this is a change that's going in where larger parking structures are going to need to be sprinklered, even if they're open parking garages. And then this change stems from just changes in car materials. They don't make the cars of the same things they've done over the years. Some of them are electric with the lithium-ion batteries, and there's a lot more plastics involved. So there's been some high-profile big fires in Europe that burned up the whole open garage. So this is just something we'll have to account for in new open parking garages. So this change has to do for unoccupied mechanical rooms. I mean, we see these often in maybe full floors. And the change is if you don't need to meet the common path of travel in those spaces. You still need to meet overall travel distance, but common path where the distance you travel to, you have to make a choice in 2 directions, 2 exits. That doesn't apply for those unoccupied mechanical rooms and penthouses. Okay, so now we're gonna, we have some time left, so we'll breeze through these. And these are key fire life safety issues that we're gonna cover and hopefully prevent your facility from looking like this.
I hope so. That would fire. Well, I would say that. So, so just there are a lot of slides here, but it's basically just copy and paste from the code. But what I wanted to, or what we wanted to bring out, security versus egress. You essentially have three ways. Well, really, it comes down to two because the third option nobody picks. But three ways of securing, and for 10.10.197, a controlled egress door, that's where your locked I2 provisions come into play. This is only for the psychiatric or mental health areas, and not for, we don't lock babies, labor delivery, we don't lock moms and dads and people visiting them, and babies, peds, we don't lock those. So some people might be familiar with the 2016 edition, where there was an exception to 10.10.19, I think it was 6 at the time, exception 2 that did talk about babies and labor delivery. That was struck in mid-cycle 2016 to take that out. But anyhow, so locked doors, where like you would expect to see in a site, that this section 10.10.197, controlled egress doors are what we call your lock doors. That's not code terminology, but that's what you're going to see in your sites. And to have those, the building has to be fully sprinklered, the entire building fully sprinklered, and then smoke detection as you've seen in the other sections, and then all these various criteria that come into play that also have to be complied with. But then there's the exception that 1 through 4 do not have to apply when the areas locked are being locked because of the clinical needs of or restraint because of the patient there. So again, your 10.10.197, your controlled egress doors, those are your locked doors like you'll see in a psych facility. Then you have delayed egress, that's your 10.10.198. And similarly, I think there are 11 now, maybe more. I think it used to be 6 or 7 criteria, but now if you're going to have a delayed egress for security, there are the various criteria again that have to be in place in order to have that delayed egress. Please put these on the plans, and we know that they'll be on different pages. Some of the information is going to be on architectural, some's going to be on electrical, but show this on the plan. So where's the release for the doors when you have delayed egress? Where's that release located? Because what happens is we get into the construction observation at the end trying to get occupancy, and the releases, we can't find the release, or the releases, somewhere down the hall and not at the nurse's station. So make sure all of these requirements, all the criteria that have to be in play in order to have delayed egress are shown on the plans. Some of it's going to look like just a list, but when it's something to be shown, show it, please. That helps in the long run. And just more, there's, like I said, there's 11 criteria that have to be in place if you're going to use delayed egress. So you got your controlled egress, your lock, like it's site, delayed egress, and then you have sensor release, electrically locked egress doors. This one we don't see too often because one of the criteria that have to be met is having a release 40 to 48 inches from the door. So you'll probably see these similar to this at work, right? When you come into your office, you might have to badge to get in, but you can freely get out because there's a sensor on that door that releases it when that panic hardware is activated. But one of the criteria for this type is when it's locked from the egress side is to have the release there. So this usually isn't an option that our facilities pick, because if you're trying to prevent someone from going somewhere and all they have to do is turn to the side and push the button, it's not really useful. But people get confused with these. Some of it can be because of the old terminology and old code, what they used to call these sections. But they've changed them now, so it's clearer that it's talking about when it's locked from the egress side. But again, your main three, not that this is it, but basically your main three are going to be the lock, the controlled egress, the delayed egress, which is basically looked at as free egress, as long as all the criteria is met, and then the sensor release. Those are your 3 types to take a look at when you look at those. We do all day classes on doors and security, so that was really not a huge lesson. It was more just to point out that you've got the 3 different ones to choose from. But when you're the controlled egress, you can only choose that one if you're looking at psych, Alzheimer's, or dementia units, not peds, not mother baby, not NICU. That you can't use that for that. That is basically left with delayed egress. Did you want to do this one?
Sure. Yeah. So stairway doors, typically, this looks like it's a discharge door maybe, but typically those are unlocked going into the stair, but the code does allow you to lock them from the interior. And so there are provisions for that, and it's something we need to observe. But I wanted to show 2 examples because this comes up in most projects where we have a conflict with security and egress. So these are 2 examples where it's been done in a compliant way. So there's a code requirement where all portions of the floor need access to at least 2 exits that are normally unobstructed, which would mean through unlocked doors, or delayed egress is an option. And so in this example, if there's only 1 stair on the left side of the plan, people in that public zone, which is to the left of the red circles, they would only have access to 1 exit stair. All their exits would be through the patient unit, which would be a locked door. And I should back up. Those red circles represent the control doors to the unit. So you see there's 2 exits on that public side, so the public occupants have access to 2 exits. This is another example where those red doors are control doors to the patient units on the left and the right. So that center spine going up and down the north-south, that's a public zone. So if I'm in there, I still got my access to 2 exits and I don't have to go through the units. So just keep that in mind when you're laying out. It's important to think about where are the locked doors, and sometimes that comes up later in the design. I was really fortunate on a recent project with we had the security consultant and us really pushing that, and we got a stair moved where it would have been an issue like in the CD phase later. So just keep this in mind, making sure we have our multiple exits, or at least two exits. This one is yours.
Okay. Corridors, we just threw this in here just a reminder. Yeah, Stephen had great pictures to add here. That's not that's what they do look like when we leave, right? But that's not what they should look like. So corridors, Title 19 doesn't allow for storage in the corridors, regardless of the width of the corridors. You got a 15-foot corridor and you think you could use part of it for storage because you got way more than 8. That's not the case. Title 19 is pretty clear that there's no storage in the corridors, one part of it, and the corridors to remain clear regardless of the width of that. Now, code does allow for certain areas to be open to the corridor, and waiting areas that's one area with certain provisions. You'll see each of these in 407, and similarly to the doors, they'll each have a certain number of criteria, around 5 or 6, that have to be met in order to be open to the corridor. So waiting areas, nurses stations, those areas can be open to the corridor. You're probably familiar with those. We have a nurses station can to indicate what can be in that nurses station. The code is clear about if a waiting area is open, what has to be in place in regard to sprinklers, smoke detection, how the corridor construction is continued. And similarly with gift shops. Gift shops can be if they're under 500 square feet. And again, a few more criteria in place. I think it was brought in I don't know if it was 13 or 16 for the psych areas, certain rooms, like their multi-purpose rooms or group therapy rooms, can be open to the corridor, but again, with a certain number of criteria met that you'll find in 407. And then for nursing home allowances, to make some of these SNFs, the skilled nursing facilities, more home-like, they wanted areas where the residents could, play cards or sit and talk or whatever. So there's certain areas that to make it more home-like that could be open to the corridor, but again, with certain criteria in place. And most of the time that's going to come with sprinklers, smoke detection, the rating of the corridor going around these spaces, but being continuous, and the 24-hour, or excuse me, the constant supervision of these spaces as well. But take a look at the code. There, for each of these specific scenarios, there are specific criteria that have to be met in order to be open to the corridor.
Yeah, and that picture was not in California. That helps.
That's good.
But I think on the 24-hour supervision, I would say take caution with that, because we have some projects where the owner doesn't envision a desk as a 24-hour staff location, but it's open to a waiting area that's open to a rated corridor for I2 occupants. And I believe that is an issue.
Yeah, and that comes up a lot. So you have, see at the top, a waiting area versus a reception area versus a lobby. They may look similar, but these are three different things with different criteria. A reception, their typical use is somebody's there during regular daytime hours and then no one's there at night, or maybe there's a security person there at night, but that's the same security person that if something happens elsewhere on that floor, that person gets up and leaves. So that supervision is no longer there. So different criteria in place depending on what you're looking at. A waiting area is not reception, and a reception is not necessarily a lobby. So really look at what your design is and what needs to be in place to have those reception areas. Generally speaking, as far as material that can be there, a desk, one or two work spaces with a chair, a computer for each person, a tabletop printer, a cabinet for jackets, purses, belongings, whatever, but not a big, huge printer, a whole bunch of chairs, a storage for files. That's not allowed in a reception area. But again, just watch that what you're looking at, that you're designing according to what it actually is and what's allowed to be there. Indeed, these are fun. This causes PTSD. I'm just kidding. But AGVS, we have a pin for this, is the pin 69. These carts are, this is just part of new technology. It's something that we work with our facilities to be able to allow these in the facilities, but criteria have to be met to have these. Like this, for example, does this look like it meets the requirements of Title 19 with no storage in the corridor regardless of the width? No, not at all. Even if the tape's there, you don't have tape that magically becomes a wall rated assembly. So the pin helps the design professionals look at what issues need to be considered when looking at putting these automated guided vehicle systems in a facility. You've got these carts, these autonomous carts going up and down the corridors with various items. Some deliver lunch, or not deliver, but some just have the lunch cart on it. Some have soiled utilities, some have trash. Some are just the little doctors on wheels, right? So there's all kinds of different HEVS, and some things to consider are they crossing smoke barrier doors? How are those smoke barrier doors going to close if this is right in the path of that? Should they cross those, or should they turn around and stay in their smoke compartment? If one thing that we recommend is room in every smoke compartment that these traverse, that it can go to in the event of a fire, so it doesn't have to cross smoke barrier doors. The fire alarm goes off, it's programmed, oh, I need to turn around and go to my room, and it goes to its room. And its room may have if it has a room, it'll have smoke detection and of course sprinklers. And as it's going in that room, it can't obstruct the exit for people who may be coming out of that room. Where these go to their home base, usually in a lower level, to get charged, there are requirements for that room, because we're back to the batteries again and what happens with the batteries. So the rooms may be rated depending on the size and the amount of battery storage, then sprinkler and smoke detection. But anyhow, a lot has happened with these in the past 15, 20 years. When we were first presented with these, the gentleman that came to our office, he left saying, you know what, I think I'm just going to keep these at poolside and hotels. It's too difficult to do in healthcare. But now with new technology, new programming that's available, these are options to have in a facility, but a lot of items need to be looked at in order to have it in there safely. Do you want these taking precedence in the elevator when the firefighter's trying to? So what happens under fire alarm conditions when this is trying to get on the elevator? So a lot of stuff to look at. I think it goes from like items A through P or something on the pin. A lot of stuff to look at. Please call us with these. You'll need an AMC for these because it's in direct violation of Title 19. But there are ways, obviously, that we can get these to be used in the facilities. So call us if you need help with these.
Okay, I think we got 3 more topics, so we'll go through them quick. So HVAC and fire alarm sequence of operations. This is something that there are minimum code requirements, but there are also owner requirements that come into play. Areas of concern are the critical carriers, the ORs. How does the owner want the ORs? What do they want the HVAC to do for those rooms during a fire alarm condition? And as well as just general HVAC for smoke compartments. We've seen different requirements where they want only the smoke compartment of alarm to shut down and isolate, and they want the HVAC to serve the rest of the hospital. So those are all different situations that if we don't plan ahead early in the design, it can be really challenging to meet the owner requirements later. And sometimes the owners don't know what they want until you explain it to them, and they say, oh yeah, that'd be nice. Or, and if that happens in CD, it's very challenging. So this is just an example where it's a nice simple layout where the mechanical engineer laid out the shafts and the ducts to really be per smoke compartment. And this allows, like, if you wanted to isolate smoke level 10 compartment A on the left, you would close the dampers in that shaft. And so you'd isolate that compartment, but really the rest of the building could keep functioning. And that gets really challenging if you have, say, shaft A on the far left. If that comes down, the duct comes down and then it goes to shaft or compartment B and C and downstream. So this shows an example. So that same image from before. So you can see the blue is the compartments, or where the patient units, generally the HVAC systems are aligned with the compartment boundaries. So you're able to achieve a design approach where compartment 1 on the left, if that has a fire, you can shut down the HVAC, isolate that compartment, and keep serving the other compartments on the floor and on the other stories. And this aligns with the defendant place concept, where the facilities know they're going to still be having patients being served, and they don't want to just shut down air throughout the hospital. And so this, so engineering judgments, it's a bittersweet topic for me.
And me.
Yeah. So there's a lot of fire-rated construction in hospitals, and it's not just the wall construction. We're dealing with penetrations of piping, utility. We're dealing with joints, like where a wall hits another wall or a floor or the curtain wall, and all those have different requirements in the code on how we protect those. And sometimes we have conditions where we have assemblies in the field. We can't meet this prescriptive, tested and listed assemblies like through UL or Intertech. And that would be a case where we need what's called an engineering judgment. So like this picture on the right is an example where we have a head of wall condition, a gyp wall coming up to a beam. If you got rid of those pipes, it'd be a typical head of wall condition. But now you have a penetration going through that SFRM. There's no tested system for that. But so then we need an engineering judgment to really justify that this is gonna meet the intent of the code. We're gonna have an F and an L rating, and we're not gonna compromise the safety of this or compromise the integrity of this fire separation. And so EJs can come up before the field or in the field, and then when it's during plan review, they have to be on the plans, and AMC may be required. And then the differentiator there is it a building element, which is in like CBC chapter 6, so that'd be like a column, beams, floor assembly, or is it one of those other items, joint, penetration, duct? So if it's in that second category, then you would need an AMC. And I think that's something definitely to talk to the FLSO on and how they want to approach that, because we have projects where there's 50 or 60 EJs trying to get submitted during plan review. And And that's a lot of material both for the design professional to go through, but also for the office to go through. So it's something that needs to be talked about, figure out a strategy. The benefit of doing it during plan review is when you get to the field, you have this EJ that and usually it's, that condition is there, and you don't have to stop for 2 weeks and get an EJ at that time. Anything you want to add?
Sure, I'll try to make it short because we're doing a whole other training on EJs. But that's another one that you might see on the HBSB list of trainings. But as Stephen mentioned, when it's for a building element, when you're looking at 703.3, and there are 6 items in there for your systems, your fire resistive rated assemblies, they've got to meet the requirements of ASTME 119 or UL 263. And then, okay, if they don't, if they're not listed approved assemblies, here are these 6 ways you could look at it. One of them, so if you look at number 4, we're talking about EJs, and then it's for a building element that if you do an EJ that you don't have a listed approved assembly for, but what you're proposing is based off of ASTME 119 or UL 263, then you wouldn't need an AMC because item number 4, 703.3 allows you to do that. But any of these others, that joints, penetrations, fire stoppings are not building elements, those you would need an AMC with your EJ for. And then like Stephen mentioned, if you're doing EJs during plan review, those EJs are on the plans. So submitting the AMC and when needed, and then having the EJs on the plan is necessary. And it's really that part of it's the same in the field. You're just doing it later. Is that you're creating EJs and AMC, and now it has to be shown on an ACD. So, and something to keep in mind when you're looking at these, we often get submittals with just a ton of EJs that, well, we used it on this other project, we think we're going to need it here. Please don't do that. Please sort through what you have and what you really need with the different engineering models. That's easier to do now with sites like UL and Intertech. There's search engines now of you plug in, what do you have? What type of construction do you have? Are you looking at it for a floor, for a wall? Is it concrete? What do you have? There's so many search or search criteria in there that you could just plug in, and then it just populates a list. Here's a whole bunch of listed approved assemblies, and pick one. If it matches, pick it, but please do the homework on that at first, as opposed to just submitting it. Because if you think about the time that it takes to review these, that adds a lot of review time, and it's a lot on your shoulders too to have to look at. So please do the homework, see what's out there. Listed approved assemblies are coming up, new ones are coming up all the time. But these sites like UL and Intertech have really changed in the past year or so, or a couple of years, and really make it a lot easier to find if a listed approved assembly exists. It's not like going through those volumes of the orange, the books anymore. So please do the homework on it. It saves time and plan review and essentially the whole building of the building.
Yeah.
Construction.
And I think firms like Hilti, they have a BIM service now with if it's worth it for that project, they'll get involved and model the EJ. They'll get really in the weeds. So that is an option along with that improved directories. The last topic we want to highlight is just meta gases, where there's often I guess some confusion sometimes on the actual requirements, because there's NFPA 99 and the CFC, and they have different requirements. There's NFPA 55. So it really depends what type of gas we're looking at. I did want to highlight that usually there's a med gas manifold room, and if that one has nitrous oxide, that is an oxidizer, and you're limited to 504 cubic feet before you trigger a special requirement in the CFC for compressed gases. And so usually that results in a 1 hour rated room and specific ventilation requirements. And if you're in an interior room, the ducts have to be fire wrapped or in a shaft enclosure. And so a lot of times that room's at the bottom of the hospital, and the allowances, if you have CO2 or nitrogen, you have higher allowances. It's the nitrous oxide or oxygen that are oxidizers. They have a lower threshold. And then as we go up in the building, the cylinder limits or the oxygen cylinder storage the limits get more restrictive as you go higher in the building. And really we're just following the California Fire Code maximum allowable quantities. But we're seeing taller and taller towers, and once you get over 6 or 7 stories, you can have, effectively it's 5% of 3,000, which is 150 cubic feet. Yeah, not a lot, but then that's why folks use this, what's on the right is a gas cabinet. So you can double that to 300 cubic feet, which then aligns with NFPA 99 limits. But you can't just have an unlimited amount of cylinder storage as you go up through the building. And so that's something that has to be coordinated. I think Nancy was telling me that there's a clarification coming that is storage. The quantities I was talking about is for storage, not cylinders in use on the floor. Is that correct?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we're constantly writing code. So right now we're in the mid-cycle 2022 timeline, and we're proposing a change, well, a footnote. It's not a huge change, but adding a footnote for the allowances on these upper floors where you don't have to count the tank that's in use by the patient. So we're looking at adding that footnote. It's again more in line than with 99 as well. So that'll help on these upper floors. But as far as storage on the upper floors, is still going to have the that criteria still going to be in place. So these cabinets will be good.
Yeah. And that is it. I think this is from one of the San Diego newer projects. That's my colleague Derek Duval in a fire pump room.
He's famous.
Yeah. Well, thank you. If there's any questions, sorry we went over by 13 minutes.
Thank you guys so much. It was really great. I'm surprised we didn't have any questions throughout, but I think everyone was just trying to soak up the information like I was. I do see that Gia has her hand raised. Gia, if you just want to unmute.
Hi. So this isn't really a life safety question, but I'm wondering, I know right now the code requirements for formula and milk prep are very, I would say, vague. I know a lot of times we refer to the infant feedings guideline, which is more a guideline and not a code. So are there going to be changes coming up in the next cycle that are more specific to formula and milk prep?
In Richard's group, Richard Tannehill and BSU, they have made some changes, and I don't know the specifics of those because unless it's combustible, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So I don't know the specifics, but I know in sitting through some of the meetings, I have heard that there are changes being proposed. I just don't know the details of those changes, but that is something that they're looking at to make it a little bit clearer.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.